Hello good people and welcome back into another Parry This History video. Today we are continuing our Kings of England series with King Æthelstan, the third in this series. He would be known as basically two things, that being the last king of the Anglo-Saxons and the first king of all English. Basically, this is just a way of recognizing that under his rule, all of what would be considered England for many years was finally united as one kingdom. This would mean that he was no longer king of the Anglo-Saxons like Edward and Ælfweard before him, but all peoples in the lands of England, including Saxons, Danes, Celts, Welsh, and various other Norse peoples. For this reason, many people consider Æthelstan and not Ælfweard to be the first king of England. While I understand this point of view, I do not agree with it. However, there is a lot to learn about this man, so sit back and enjoy as we dive on in and learn all about him. Æthelstan was born around 894 AD, the son of Edward the Elder and his first wife Ecgwynn. There is debate in the historical community as to the legitimacy of Æthelstan given the debate surrounding his mother. Some historians maintain that she was of common birth, while others firmly believe that she was of noble stock. And aside from Ecgwynn's lineage, there are some that maintain that she was a mistress and not a legitimate wife. I firmly disagree with this point of view and believe that all evidence we have points to the contrary. Given that Æthelstan was fostered at the noble court of Æthelflæd, the Lady of the Mercians, and raised as an Ætheling, and would later ascend to the throne, I would say that it is highly unlikely that he was a bastard. In addition to this, whether or not the marriage was illegitimate, Ælfweard the Great, Æthelstan's grandfather, ennobled him as a youth, presenting him with a royal purple mantle, a girdle set with precious stones, and a Saxon sword in a golden scabbard. This suggests that Ælfweard was seeking to remove all doubt of Æthelstan's legitimacy, and likely sought to name him as his heir, to solidify the dynastic succession. It is likely that these questions of illegitimacy come from the family and allies of Edward's second wife, Ælfweard, who had the most to gain from Æthelstan being considered illegitimate, as it would bump up her own children in likelihood to succeed Edward after his death. In any case, Edward the Elder would die in July of 924 AD when Æthelstan was 30 years old. When this happened, Æthelstan would immediately be crowned king of Mercia, and his younger half-brother Ælfweard would be pronounced the king in Wessex. However, Ælfweard would actually never be coronated as king, as he would die just 16 days after his father had died. Some have suggested that his death was ordered by Æthelstan, but this is simply speculation, as there has never been any evidence to support this supposed plot. In any case, with Ælfweard dead, Æthelstan would become the king of all England on the 4th of September 925 at Kingston upon Thames, which was the traditional coronation site of Saxon kings. He would be crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Athelm, who would actually write a new coronation service for the occasion, as Æthelstan was the first West Saxon king to wear a crown as his royal symbol of office as opposed to the traditional Saxon helmet. This new ordo was likely inspired by West Frankish liturgy and would go on to inspire later medieval French liturgy. However, even after being crowned king and accepted in Wessex, Æthelstan would experience resistance in Wessex for several months and would face multiple conspiracies against his rule there early in his reign. The first of these conspiracies would actually be one that was intended to blind him. This plot was contrived by a group of noblemen from Wessex who had aligned themselves with the younger brothers of Æthelstan, those who came from Edward the Elder's second marriage. This plot was intended to remove Æthelstan as king, as blinding was considered a disability that would make him unfit to rule, but it would not incur the heavy consequences of regicide, which would include death for all conspirators and the revocation of all family lands and titles. However, this plot would fail and the conspirators would be identified and brought to justice. There would be a later plot to support one of Æthelstan's younger half-brothers in open revolt against him, this time the brother being Edwin, the younger brother of Ælfweard. This plot would also fail. Historians disagree regarding this event. Some have suggested that after a failed rebellion, which likely died without a battle due to the lack of popular support, Edwin attempted to flee England and died at sea. The other story is that when Æthelstan discovered this plot, he ordered that Edwin be set out to sea in a small boat with no provisions, and while at sea, Edwin died. In either case, the death of Edwin in 933 and the discovery of these plots would end the opposition to Æthelstan's rule from Winchester. When Edward the Elder died, the Saxon lands he had consolidated passed to his heir, who would ultimately turn out to be Æthelstan. These lands would include all Saxon lands south of the Humber. This would mean the entirety of Wessex, Mercia, and East Anglia would all be under Æthelstan's direct rule. In addition to this, he inherited overlordship of most of the princes of Wales, as well as Cornwall. So Æthelstan started out his reign with considerable power and influence. In 926 AD, in alliance with Ealdred of Bamburgh, a Saxon ruler of a powerful fortress and an ally of Edward and later Æthelstan, Æthelstan would conquer most of what was formerly the Kingdom of Northumbria. This would mean that in this year, Æthelstan would have consolidated direct rule over nearly the entirety of what would be medieval England. The last remaining obstacle to this objective was the Viking Kingdom of York, which was being ruled over by Sihtric Cath. In 926, after conquering the rest of Northumbria and surrounding York, Æthelstan would marry off his sister Edith to Sihtric, who would convert to Christianity. Æthelstan and Sihtric would agree not to invade each other's lands or to support each other's enemies. A year later, in 927 AD, Sihtric would die, and with the aid and influence of his sister Edith, Æthelstan would be welcomed into York, where he would finally bring it into his kingdom, thus completing medieval England. Æthelstan would then send his sister Edith to marry Otto I, who would later become the Holy Roman Emperor. Of course, Æthelstan's struggles would not stop with the conquest of Northumbria and York. He would spend the remainder of his rule working to maintain these lands, establish his rule, and build stability. Shortly after taking York, a man named Guthfrith, a cousin of Sihtric, tried to claim the throne of York, but Æthelstan outmaneuvered him, and the Danes would submit to Æthelstan's rule in York, thus ending Guthfrith's claim. Then, on the 12th of July 927, King Constantine II of Scotland, King Hywel of Deheubarth, Eldred of Bamburgh, and King Owain of Strathclyde gathered at Aymont near Penrith to accept Æthelstan as their overlord. This is the moment where most historians agree that King Æthelstan could accurately be known as the King of the English. With all of England under his direct rule, Æthelstan spent 7 years of watchful peace improving and strengthening the administrative nature of his realm. One reform that Æthelstan paid particular attention to was coinage. Much like his father and grandfather before him, Æthelstan understood the necessity for a currency that inspired trust, and so he regulated this industry heavily. He created standards for all Saxon mints, insisting that they become uniform. Prior to this, Edward's reforms had introduced calibration and standard weights and purity, but Æthelstan's reforms included standardized designs. Æthelstan believed that the more uniform the coins from all over his vast lands, the more trust the coins would carry. Under his rule, after he conquered York, Æthelstan issued his new coinage, which was known as the circumscription cross type, which carried the inscription Rex Totius Britanniae, which was Æthelstan's fancy new title as the King of all Britain. And these coins would later be the first English silver pennies to carry the image of a king on their reverse side, and this king would of course be Æthelstan. Æthelstan would also be a great reformer of laws, much like his grandfather Ælfweard, and would seek to codify justice at all levels in his kingdom. His law reforms would be massive, and the two largest and most notable reforms were both aimed at improving the foundation of English society. The first was a tax imposed on all of his lords and landowners. This tax was designed to be collected by the king and used at his discretion to aid the poor in times of strife and destitution. In many years, this was a national safety net program to ensure the crown had money set aside for aid in the case of war, disaster, or famine. This money was to be used for the common good when necessary, and would therefore relieve strain on the local lord. The logic being that if a famine hurts a region, the lord of that region is not able to handle the issue on his own, given that their money comes from the land. This idea is one that Æthelstan copied from his great-grandfather Æthelwulf, who had imposed a similar tax for a similar purpose. The other major law reforms that Æthelstan undertook were in regards to theft. At this time, theft, both on a small and large scale, was a major problem in England. King Æthelstan saw this as a rot that deteriorated society and as the core problem that led to much of the other problems in his kingdom, such as hunger, economic disruption, and violence. His response was to codify the death penalty for anyone over 12 years old who was caught in the theft of anything worth more than 8 silver pennies. This policy would achieve little, and he would later reform again. His first reform was to allow for people to pay restitution for their crimes, but the end result of this was rich families keeping their relatives out of penalties while poorer criminals were executed. Seeing the inequality of justice and feeling that many young people were being harshly affected by his policy, Æthelstan would reform yet again, this time to his most moderate policy. This new policy would remove the restitution clause and would raise the minimum age of the death penalty to 15. This policy would include second chances for younger people between the age of 12 and 15, who would receive lesser punishments, typically flogging. As a result of this harsh but comparatively more fair policy, robbery and general theft would decline during Æthelstan's rule. During the reign of Æthelstan, the church would once again flourish and grow, as it had under Ælfweard. Many new bishoprics would be founded, and the faith would thrive again. Some of the new sees would include 2 new bishoprics in Wessex, likely to counter the power of the Bishop of Winchester, who had long been opposed to Æthelstan. Æthelstan also established a new see in Cornwall to further his influence there, as the Cornish had long opposed Saxon rule and culture. Æthelstan was a collector of holy relics and had a reputation amongst his own subjects as well as continental rulers as someone who valued holy items more than treasure. As such, he would often receive famous religious relics as gifts, such as part of the crown of thorns as well as Charlemagne's spear, which was said to contain a piece of Longinus' spear, the weapon that was thrust into Christ's side during the crucifixion. However, Æthelstan did not hoard these religious relics and instead made gifts of them to the many churches, abbeys, and minsters in his kingdom. This would help to inspire worship amongst his people and lead to a Saxon golden age of faith, which had not been seen since the beginning of the Viking invasions and the sack of Lindisfarne. During Æthelstan's reign, many pagans who had held out during Ælfweard and Edward's reigns would willingly convert to Christianity and become faithful Christians, thus improving the societal cohesion of his kingdom. Æthelstan would also make significant contributions to the educational and cultural world in his time. Much like his grandfather Ælfweard the Great, Æthelstan would place great importance on education. He would bring many great scholars from the continent to England and would encourage education of as many young people as possible. During this time, there was a great resurgence in Saxon poetry, and many more works were translated into Old English. There would also be a Latin revival in his time, which would center on the elaborate hermeneutic style of Latin writing. This style was characterized by long, convoluted sentences and a predilection for rare words and neologisms. This would be a significant departure from the shorter, terser style of earlier Saxon literature and legal documents, as it emphasized the importance and even the prestige of learned intelligence. It would go out of style again shortly after Æthelstan's reign, but many of the works during this time would inspire future works for years to come. It is theorized that Beowulf was actually written during the reign of Æthelstan, and England once again saw a large re-interest and surge in monastic life due to the reforms that were made by the people that Æthelstan brought into the many monasteries across England. Lastly, for administrative details, Æthelstan also reformed the way that administration in general was handled in Saxon England. Under Æthelstan, the way that land was governed changed drastically to reflect the growing size and scope of his kingdom. In an attempt to prevent the further fracturing of his nation as a result of countless ealdormen being raised to different regions, Æthelstan granted authority to much larger areas. Whereas previously an ealdorman controlled a single shire, sometimes a very small one, now they were being given more and more land. As an example, one ealdorman, also named Æthelstan, governed the entirety of East Anglia as a single province. This was the beginning of the more feudalized society that England would become, where there were far fewer high lords and they controlled much larger areas. Under the ealdormen were what was known as reeves, who were royal officials approved by the king to act as a local noble landowner, to govern a single town, burgh, or royal estate. These reeves would report to their ealdormen, who would report to the king. At this time, bishops would also be responsible for the governance of church lands in a very similar manner to ealdormen, and would attend councils and provide troops as such. In 934 AD, with his large unified kingdom mostly secure, and his many reforms complete or at least underway, Æthelstan would decide to invade Scotland. There is great debate as to why. Some historians have posited that the death of Ecgwynn in 933 removed the resistance to his rule in Wessex, and freed him up for the more ambitious campaign. Others have suggested that when Ealdred of Bamburgh died in 934, there was a struggle between Constantine of Scotland and Æthelstan for Ealdred's land, and this is what prompted the invasion. In any case, in May of 934, Æthelstan started the campaign, and along with 4 Welsh kings, 18 bishops, and 13 earls, he marched his large Saxon army north to Scotland. The invasion was a joint land and sea operation, where his land forces would ravage through Scotland as far north as Dunnottar in northeast Scotland, and his fleet would raid Caithness as well as a portion of the Norse kingdom of Orkney. There are no large-scale recorded battles from this campaign. It is likely that given the size and strength of the force that Constantine fell back and avoided the army or took up defensive positions and waited for them to leave. The outcome isn't perfectly clear, but afterwards Constantine would pay tribute to Æthelstan, so it's likely that the campaign would be considered an English success. In any case, by September, Æthelstan was back in Buckingham in southern England, where we have a charter with Constantine as witness noted as sub regulus, thus acknowledging Æthelstan as his overlord. In 937 we have the last major event of Æthelstan's rule. that being the Battle of Brunanburh. This battle was fought between Æthelstan and an alliance of his enemies, namely Olaf Guthfrithson, the King of Dublin and the son of Guthfrith, the Dane whom Æthelstan had defeated and prevented from seizing York. Olaf would ally with Constantine II of Scotland, who was still steaming about the defeat a few years prior, as well as Owain, the King of the British Kingdom of Strathclyde. The alliance would invade England, likely in two forces, Olaf's army coming in a fleet down the Humber River, with Constantine and Owain marching down through Northumbria. The two armies would meet up and ravage the area around the Humber, possibly raiding into Mercia. Æthelstan would take his time mustering his forces and would march north with a large Saxon army comprised entirely of men from Wessex and Mercia. His younger half-brother Edmund would accompany him. The English army would meet the enemy alliance and make battle. The location of this battle is contested, but it is most likely either Bromborough on the Wirral Peninsula or on what is now a golf course in Bebington. The details of this battle are not well recorded. The battle was reported in the Annals of Ulster as follows. A great, lamentable, and horrible battle was cruelly fought between the Saxons and the Northmen, in which several thousands of Northmen, who are uncounted, fell, but their king Olaf escaped with a few followers. A large number of Saxons fell on the other side, but Æthelstan, king of the Saxons, enjoyed a great victory. Outside of this, what we do know is that the Celtic-Norse alliance dug themselves into the battlefield prior to the battle. They constructed many fortifications, including timber-lined trenches and palisade walls. The Saxon army would overcome these defenses, likely fighting primarily in a shield wall formation. The fighting is said to have gone on for an entire day, and during the course of the battle, 5 kings and 7 earls died in the carnage. Among the casualties were 2 of King Æthelstan's cousins, Ælfric and Ethgwynn, as well as a prominent Saxon bishop. On the other side, Constantine of Scotland would retreat after the death of his son, and the ultimate rout of his forces. According to some sources, the Saxon army would even mount a cavalry charge on the enemy. This account would contradict many historical authorities who maintain that Saxons only ever fought on foot. This event does not appear in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, so it is likely that if a cavalry charge did take place, it would have been by mercenaries, possibly West Frankish horsemen. However, in the end, the result was clear, a definite English victory that solidified English rule and dominion, at least for a time. And although antagonism from the Scots and the Norse would not end here, for the most part it would for the British. The victory at Brunanburh is extremely important, and would be among the 3 key battles of early English history, those 3 being Ethandun, Brunanburh, and Hastings. This victory would prevent the dissolution of England, but unfortunately would not unite the island, as Scotland and Strathclyde would remain independent kingdoms. Despite not unifying the island through military force here, the Battle of Brunanburh had a great cultural impact. In the words of Livingston, this is where Englishness came of age. After so many years of conflict, strife, and division, this is the battle that sees a unified English force defeat an alliance of England's key enemies, in the British, their oldest rivals, as well as the Scots and the Norse, who had almost conquered the island and had been at war against the Saxon people for generations at this point. This victory has great military significance, but even more so inspired national pride, and helped lay the building blocks for England as an idea that actually meant something to not just the royal house or even the nobility, but to the common people. This patriotism was uncommon at the time, and would become something that would define England for centuries to come. Æthelstan would die at Gloucester on October 27th, 939, at the age of 45. He was unmarried and would leave no heirs. His younger half-brother, Edmund I, would succeed him as King of England. Æthelstan would choose not to honor the city responsible for the primary resistance to his rule, that being Winchester, and would will that his remains be entombed at Malmesbury Abbey, beside his cousins who had died at Brunanburh. His remains would remain here beneath the altar until being moved to the Abbey Garden in the 11th century, to avoid desecration by the Normans. His remains would be dug up and lost during the Reformation, when many saints and kings would be disturbed and destroyed or dispersed by Reformationists seeking to destroy their Christian history. In the 15th century, a new and empty tomb would be placed in Malmesbury Abbey to act as a memorial monument for Æthelstan. Despite being overshadowed by the achievements of his grandfather, Alfred the Great, Æthelstan is remembered as the father of England, and in the words of William of Malmesbury, no one more just or more learned ever governed the kingdom. But that is where we will end it for today. Join us next time when we discuss the life and reign of Æthelstan's successor, his younger half-brother, Edmund I.